Hello, good afternoon. Thank you to everyone for attending the webinar today. We're really lucky to be joined by Karim Harji, who is our Impact Measurement Programme Director at Oxford University Saïd Business School. But before we get started on the content, I'd like to hand over to Yulia Sukenko, who will just give a quick talk about the Vladimir Potanin Foundation and the work that they do. So, Yulia, if I can hand over to you, please.
Hello, everyone. I welcome every participant today for this webinar. And this is really a pleasure to be a part of this webinar today. My name is Yulia Sukhenko, and along with my colleague Yulia Lizicheva, we represent the Vladimir Potanin Foundation today. I'm the project manager, and Yulia Lizicheva is the program director. And first of all, I would like to thank the Saïd Business School of the University of Oxford for organizing this webinar for the Russian audience. This is really an honor for all of us, and especially I thank Karim for finding his time to introduce us this interesting subject such as impact measurement, despite the time difference. So thank you very much. I will say a few words about the foundation, which has been implementing its projects for more than 20 years. Long-term projects and large-scale projects within three main areas such as culture, philanthropy development, and education. Last year we launched the Center of Philanthropy, and it has been doing very well, organizing internships and trainings for Russian representatives of non-governmental organizations, exchange trainings. It also does research on the philanthropy, how it develops in Russia and overseas, on the infrastructure of philanthropy. This year, we started the new program titled The Power of Sport, focusing on the social projects in the area of sport. As for our partnership with the Saïd Business School of the University of Oxford, it started 3 years ago when in 2017 at the International Annual Endowments Forum, we announced the competition for Russian representatives of NGOs to attend the program called Social Finance at the University of Oxford. And for 3 years, about 15 participants attended the program. And undoubtedly, that was a unique experience for all of them, because they had this chance to dive into international environment, to communicate with true professionals, to get skills and knowledge and experience from true experts in the field, in the sector, to learn what the social finance is, so that they could implement this knowledge in their own organizations. And next year, we are going to continue our partnership with the Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, along with the social finance program. We are going to support the impact measurement program. And today, Karim will tell us about this program. So we're all very excited and thrilled to learn what it is. So again, on a competition basis, there will be a competition, and it will be conducted by the school itself. Applications should be directed to the school. we encourage you to participate in this competition. Please follow us on our website and in our social networks. And thank you very much. Again, it's a true pleasure to be with you today, to be a part of this webinar. And Karim, I pass you a word and welcome you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia, for that opening. Really appreciate it. And thanks again for your support of our programs and also just helping us to raise awareness of topics, social finance and now impact measurement, for different audiences. As we'll talk about shortly, these topics are gaining traction globally and in various regions. And so it's our pleasure to also just provide a bit of insight into our programs, the way that we teach, and then just introduce you today to some of the concepts around impact measurement in the way that we frame them. And then what I'm going to try and do is give you a bit of a sense of how we frame these concepts within the program itself. And then for the audience that is maybe less familiar with the topic, to provide a few examples of approaches and trends and challenges, and we'll try and make this interactive. I'd love to hear as we go along your questions, so please submit them in the chat. So I'll begin by introducing the program very briefly, and we'll have contact information at the end to Annabelle, who can share more information around any of our programs, including impact measurement, and if you're interested in applying, the more information on how to do that. I'm going to situate the kind of teaching framework that we use, just to give you a sense of a framework that you might be able to use in your own work. Give you a bit of an overview of some of the trends and these challenges and directions, and then we'll spend a bit of time on your questions. So please submit them through the chat function or through the Q&A function, and I will pick them up as we go, or in the last part of our segment here today. So let me jump right in and start with the program. So I'm Karim, I'm the program director. This program has now been around for about 3 years. It really is part of a broader suite of programs that I'll talk about shortly that are responding to some of the questions, some of the newer questions that are getting asked, not only in business schools, but more broadly in society. There are, particularly now in the last 6 months with the pandemic, lots of organizations and people are asking themselves questions around how do we measure and value the things that really matter beyond simply using the terms that are economic or financial. We know that the success of organizations, for example, are judged many times by how much money they make, how much money they have. But the reality is that we all make decisions not only based on financial concerns, but also on non-financial concerns. We all value different things in terms of social, environmental, or cultural aspects. And increasingly, organizations are trying to find frameworks and tools to be able to capture the social, environmental, and cultural value that they're creating in order to be more explicit, to be more definitive about how they communicate that and how they can improve that. And so what the program is really designed to do is to help participants from a range of different countries. So often when we have a class of around 40 to 50 annually, we have representation from at least 20 countries, so it's quite globally diverse. We bring together senior executives to do a variety of things. The first is to give them exposure to a range of global tools and perspectives and frameworks, help them think through the opportunities and limitations of these different kinds of tools or ways of thinking about impact. We try and be very hands-on by using a combination of lectures, tutorials, and group work. And also recognizing that certainly we've got very qualified and experienced faculty that teach this, but also many of the people that are coming bring a lot of experience. And so we use the the program to tease out and to encourage the ability of sharing between people. And then, as I can explain a bit later, if you're interested, we have a fairly structured learning journey before the program, during, and then after the program, through our workbook and curated conversations and webinars, etc. So, we can share more information about that if you're interested. And just to say very quickly that we do a lot of research in these different areas, everything from how we can rethink accounting systems to incorporate social and environmental value, to how evaluators that work in the public sector or social sector may engage with the private sector. How do we think about issues like well-being and happiness? How do we think about social entrepreneurship and measurement of entrepreneurship efforts, as well as the kinds of tools and approaches that are being developed and used and adapted within the social sector and charitable sector. So just to say that one of the unique things about this program is that we draw on the private, public, and social sectors as we think about how impact is being interpreted, the measurement approaches, and then how we think about what we can learn from these sectors to improve how organizations describe, measure, and report on their social value. This is the broad structure of how the program is, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the teaching framework that we use, because we start by framing these concepts around why we measure before we talk about what we measure and then how. I'll give you a bit of insight into that today. There are lots of ways to measure impact, but it's really important to understand what you bring in terms of the questions you have, the type of evidence you're seeking, and how you're going to use that to inform your decision making. So that's how we construct the week in that order. And then when we look to the end of the week, it's really about some of the possibilities and potential of impact measurement looking forward. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that in the second half of the presentation. As I said, we have a larger suite of programs, and Yulia indicated this with the social finance program. We also have a long-standing impact investing program. And there's a nice intersection between these programs. I teach in our other two programs as well. And so if you're interested in those, Annabelle can share more information with you. So let me dive into some of the content around impact measurement. And what I'm going to try and do is give you a set of perspectives around impact, and then tell you a little bit about the teaching approach that we use for the week, and guide you through some content and some polls. So one thing to note is that there are many different perspectives around how this term impact is framed. And you might also have heard some of these kinds of perspectives when people talk about these concepts of impact or measurement. So on one hand, in the private sector, there's often this phrase at the bottom that says you can't manage what you can't measure. So that measurement is really important to help inform how we manage, how we set strategy, and then how we engage and build the rest of the organization to accomplish our goals. The quote at the top, which is often credited to Einstein, but there's a few other people that have said variations of this, that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And really, this is one of the challenges we have in impact measurement, is that sometimes the things that are easiest to measure aren't the things that are most important to people, to organizations, and to society. And then sometimes the things that we think really matter to us, again, as individuals or a society, may be really difficult to boil down to a single number. And so part of the opportunity, but also the challenge of impact measurement, is to try and understand, are we measuring the right things? Do we understand what we can do with that information? And even when things are complex to measure, can we ensure that we find ways to begin to understand the story of what is happening, how we can include different stakeholder perspectives, and that informs our decision making over time, so that we're not using the wrong information or incomplete information to make decisions about things that maybe matter to people and we're not just using, for example, just financial information. One other challenge that we'll talk about in impact measurement is that we love metrics, we love numbers, and sometimes we think that that's the best or the only kind of information that is helpful. And as we'll talk about later, it's not necessarily true. I think one opportunity is to find the right combination of qualitative information, of cases, of stories, of narratives, alongside the numbers to be able to tell a more complete story of what is happening. So we'll jump into a poll shortly just to engage all of you, but I wanted to just situate this. We all are aware that in the last 6 months, the world has changed in ways that we may not have been able to predict, anticipate, and it's affecting all of our work. I've run this poll in a variety of different settings, and I'd love to just hear it from you. And so going to ask you to pick which of the following statements resonates with you as a result of the experience from the last 6 months. And that the choices we have here are that maybe you now value certain things more than you did before. Maybe you're now valuing different things than you did before. So option one is that you are maybe valuing the things that you knew were valuable. You're paying more attention to them. Maybe you've identified other things that you think are more important than you might have appreciated before. Option three is that things are connected in ways you may not have seen or expected before. Option four is that there are or will be a lot of negative effects. I mean, those are obvious. But option five is there are or will be unintended positive effects. And so I'd love to just get your take. Maybe we can launch the poll now, just to give us a sense of how you are thinking about these issues of what has changed in your work, in your thinking. And so if you can vote now, and then we'll share the results. This is really to just start to get you thinking about some of these issues in a bit of a broader context before we get into some of the technical details. So all of you should see the poll. So please pick one option, and then we will see what you said, and then maybe use that to prompt a bit of a discussion. And it's interesting just for me to see how you might compare to other groups, and we'll pick up on this maybe in the Q&A as well. So Bryn, maybe we can close the poll now. Okay. And I think we are sharing results. Yes. Okay. So interesting. We have a bit of a tie between there are or will be unintended positive effects. It's a very optimistic group. I like it. As well as I now value certain things more than I did before. Interestingly, and interesting for me at least, that only one person voted that there are or will be a lot of negative effects. That is something that tends to be the default answer, but I really like it when we have a bit more variation. As you can see, these questions are intentionally designed to maybe provoke some thinking or discussion. And also, several of you said that you now value different things than you did before. So I'd love to hear as we go along in the chat, if you can share some of your reactions to this choice around unintended positive effects. If you can share with us what you're thinking, or when you talk about I now value certain things than I did before, what that might look like. But let's maybe move on, because I'd love to now begin to situate some of this within how we think about some of these questions around impact and measurement. So when we define impact in the program, and this definition is used somewhat broadly, but not everybody agrees on all of these components. So often we're talking about some kind of material or significant changes, and these changes could be positive or negative. We often talk about long-term conditions, either of people or the planet or broader systems, that might have been intended or unintended beyond what would have been expected to occur on its own. So a couple of components really just to get you thinking around when we talk about material or significant changes, we should ask how much is it enough to be significant? Positive or negative? Who defines what's positive or negative, or how much should be enough to be defined positive or negative? Long term, we know that also there are short-term things, medium-term things, and long-term, and that often there is a relationship between what happens with people, the planet, and different kinds of systems. Unintended or intended is a really important concept because sometimes we do things and there might be unintended effects. Those are equally important to understand what is happening. As much as we tend to measure the intended effects, it might be equally important to also identify unintended effects, and particularly if they are negative, to ensure that we have some ability to see them, to mitigate any risks, or to address them so that we are doing no harm that might be counter or opposite to the positive intended effects. And beyond what would have occurred anyway, now this is a very challenging one sometimes in practice to unpack. And there's this question of additionality or attribution. And so we can talk about that if that's interesting to you. A couple of themes that we talk about is that often people, when they hear the term measurement, they think it's a very technical, complex exercise, and we don't think that that's how you should interpret it. We think that it's an ongoing process of not only measuring to look back, but managing forward. So you should understand certainly what has happened, but you also want to use that information to look ahead. And so in that way, it's not just a technical exercise, it is a strategy and management exercise moving forward. It's really important to also integrate different perspectives from your stakeholders rather than just the people that are making the decisions. And that's always a little bit difficult to do in practice, to make sure that all your stakeholders are consulted in terms of how do they define impact, who defines positive or negative in certain ways, and how are they engaged in the process of understanding and engaging with you on assessing or valuing certain kinds of impacts. And as we'll talk about, the kinds of choices you make, the types of constraints you work within, and also the context more broadly, whether it's local or regional, the sector you work in, the type of organization, will all have an influence on the type of approach you use and also the kinds of decisions you make around impact measurement. And so I guess one important point to make around these various bullets is that this is not a 5-step exercise where you move from step 1 to step 5 and it's the same process for everybody. There are some rules of thumb, but it also is subject to interpretation to make it most useful and appropriate for your context. So in the program, we do have this overall framework that I'd encourage you to think about and use and adapt for your own organizations. And we start from asking why we measure, to then looking at what should we measure, to then thinking about how we might measure, and then to how you will use the information and make decisions and act. And one of the observations we found and why we use this as our critical framework for the program is that often people start right away at the how do we measure. So they jump straight into a measurement approach or try and pick a set of indicators or try and pick one methodology. And then they realize often that maybe it doesn't really help them make the decisions they thought. Maybe it's too complicated and they're not really able to understand what decisions they will make. Maybe they haven't fully engaged their stakeholders, or they haven't really thought through the different aspects of what they could be measuring, or have maybe had an incomplete approach to measurement. And so I'll introduce each of these kind of topics very briefly, but just to say that one of the themes that we emphasize in the program is that ask the questions in the right order and start with your why, then move to your what, and then it's much easier to figure out how to measure. There are at least 3 whys, there might be more. Often we are trying to prove something because we had a set of expectations around what we thought impact would look like. So this is our expected or anticipated impacts. Often when you're designing a program or a strategy, you draw on some information, whether it's your own experience, the experience of other organizations, some data or some research to say, we're trying to address this issue. We think through our program or through our investment, we will have this kind of impact. And often you want to know, can we prove that? But often that's not enough. We also want to understand in the future, how will we make decisions differently in terms of improving our impact? Is it simply a matter of, let's say, providing more investment into a program to scale it or to grow it? Is it about targeting different populations or using a different program strategy to generate better outcomes? Is it about providing different kinds of supports, for example, through partnering or through bringing more evidence or research to improve your impact? So often proving is important, but you also want to understand how to look forward to improve your impact. And many of you might also be actively learning as you're going through the process around impact measurement, because we often are trying to look at new or innovative places where we apply programs or investments. And so when we're partnering up with other organizations, we may want to understand, are we collaborating in the right ways? Are we contributing new evidence around what is working? Can this help others? You know, whether you work in private companies, whether you work in government or in the charitable sector, to think about the right way to partner and to target your work. So it's really important then to unpack your intended uses, your why, which you can see at the top, the prove, improve, and learn, but also to then think a bit more about who is thinking about each of those goals. So this is just an example of within an organization or within different kinds of organizations, you might have your staff, your board, but also you might have clients or users or beneficiaries, and then you might have your funders. And so each segment might have a different set of goals, and your measurement approach should be clear around how it might meet some or all of these. As you can see, no one approach is probably going to help you get to all of these goals. And it may not be appropriate for all of your stakeholders. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that organizations face, is they think that one approach is going to just give everybody the answers that they are seeking. But if your clients want to understand in what ways can they are the services helping them or helping them relative to other clients, it's very different from how your board might want to understand whether you're being accountable for your mission, or how you are different from other organizations, or what it is that they might need to learn and help the organization improve on its work. And again, very different from how a funder might interpret whether you are financially sustainable versus whether you are the right organization to scale a specific intervention. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a set of criteria that you might be able to identify in your organization. You know, what are our goals? Who is it that we are trying to look at as the users of this information? And what might be different about what information each stakeholder might need based on their goals? So we're going to launch one more poll just to try and keep you engaged, and also to understand within these goals, prove, improve, and learn. What do you think, if you reflect on your organization, might be the primary goal of impact measurement? So you could pick one of those goals, prove, improve, or learn. You could pick a combination of the above, or maybe you're unsure. So we have the poll up now. And why don't we start the voting and see where you land? And it's all anonymous, so you can be as honest as you'd like. And probably we, set up the combination one to try and get some of you who are trying to really advance and build on existing impact measurement, whereas other organizations maybe are just getting started. So we'll leave this open for a few more seconds. I see that people are voting, which is great. Okay, thank you, Bryn. So that's great. Maybe unsurprising. Usually I don't provide combination just to provoke a discussion to see whether people are forced to choose, but this is not unusual in that often organizations are trying to both look at 2 or 3 of those goals in parallel. And it's good that some of you identified a few of the others just in terms of prove, and then one each for improve and learn. I think this is really important for those of you that identified combination. The question we don't have a lot of time for, but this is the kind of thing that we would do in the program. But I'd love to hear in the chat, when you think about the combination answer that you described, do you feel that your stakeholders or your organizational colleagues actually think about these goals in these ways? That when they think about the questions or that they're asking on impact measurement, that they distinguish the different uses of it. For those of you that replied prove, that's often the very traditional view. A funder or a set of funders, give you funding if you're an organization, and really just want to know, did the things happen that they expected to happen? And we know that often life is not as simple as that lots of other things happen, which is why we tend to have learning goals, that are quite explicit around making sure that not only we look back at what happened, but also try and understand, are we contributing to solving the issues that we talk about in all the right ways? So why don't we keep moving forward? Again, please submit your comments through the chat or through the Q&A so we can pick them up, and hopefully these are beginning to provoke some thinking or help provide some language around things you're already working on and would love to hear more about. So there are a lot of questions when we think about why impact measurement is or is seen to be difficult. These are some of the more common ones. People often ask, what should I measure? What approach do I use? Who's actually going to do the measurement? How do I pay for this? How am I going to actually use the information that I'm collecting? And there's also often technical questions around, can you actually have objective measurement when some of the things maybe that we are trying to measure are really subjective? So for example, if you're running a program that is providing access to education or better education or training, you might be able to ask, how many people have we reached? But that doesn't really tell you whether people's self-confidence might have improved, and even how do you measure that over time? There are ways to do that, but that's often one of the big challenges is, can you look at objective data and subjective data together? There's also a bit of a question sometimes around, can we get information that is standardized or comparable? So for example, how many people have we reached? You could compare that to maybe other organizations, but the context really matters. What if you are working in a rural setting versus an urban setting? Well, you might be reaching a lot of people in an urban setting, but in a rural setting, maybe people don't have another option. And so that context is really important to bring to how you interpret your data and differentiate your approach. And these are some of the kinds of tensions when organizations think about what to measure and how to measure, and there might be other questions. So in the chat, again, would love to hear about other questions you have around why this is seen to be difficult, or maybe in your own organization, why it actually is difficult. We won't have a poll for this now because we want to get through a bit of the content, but I encourage you to maybe respond to this in the chat if you can, in terms of what is the top challenge for impact measurement in your organization. Is it around deciding why or what to measure? Is it about choosing approaches or methods? Is it about maybe asking who will do it internally, or maybe a lack of internal capacity, or how you will use it for decisions or other? So I'll encourage you maybe to just think about these and respond in the chat if you can, and then we'll pick some of this up in the Q&A or the discussion in a few minutes. So moving from why to what. Again, we spend a lot more time on this, so I just want to give you a bit of a snapshot on some frameworks and maybe ways of thinking about the what dimension. Often we think about direct impacts versus indirect impacts. If you're an organization that is providing a product or a service, you might look at the characteristics of that product or service. You might look at who it's who is using it, so the profile of the user. Do you define them by their income, by where they live, by their age, by their poverty level? There are lots of different aspects to describe who is your user or customer or client, and how do they relate to your product or service. Do they have, is your product or service, for example, if you're providing training, is this training that they would have otherwise gotten elsewhere, or is this training that is quite unique? How have they identified that they need this training? And often we want to look at both output measures, which tend to be much more short-term, much more easy to count. How many people attended your training? How many of them identified that they were satisfied with the training? How many of them showed up, let's say, for all sessions of the training? Which is quite different from outcomes. You want to understand, did that training lead to something? You know, if you're providing an educational intervention of any kind, the outcomes happen over a longer period of time rather than a shorter period of time. And so on one hand, we want to look at the more direct or tangible effects. And then we want to also understand the broader or indirect effects. What happens with different groups of people that you are affecting, you know, not only the individuals that directly access your product or service, but also the community or different population groups. What about the broader issue that you're trying to address, whether it is poverty or access to education or training or other areas or issues? It is also really important to then ask, how are we defining what the need is? Is it defined by the user, or are we defining it on the basis of research or some broader societal need, like the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which many of you may be familiar with? Do we only measure positive effect, or are we also thinking about some negative effects? What does positive or negative look like differently if I define it versus if you define it? What would be intended versus unintended? How would you define an unintended effect from the perspective of your client or user compared to someone in your organization? And then often we have some things we want to test in terms of our expectations, and the reality might look quite different. You know, we imagine, for example, that we understand who the product, the users or the clients might be of the interventions, but what is their lived experience? Can we actually step in their shoes? Is it possible? How much impact is enough? That's a big, important set of questions. And again, we might have a different perspective than the people that are going through our programs or our investments. And then importantly, how to ensure that we're doing no harm? Because often we might have good intentions, but as we know, the reality of a lot of interventions is not as simple as you provide a product or a service or, you know, a training or something like a partnership, but maybe there are unintended or unexpected negative effects as a result of that. We see that a lot when there are technology solutions, for example, that might be replacing, for example, jobs. And so while tech can also have a really positive and important contribution, maybe it has some harms in terms of taking away jobs, maybe infringing on privacy. So there are a lot of interesting questions I think we can ask when we ask the question of do no harm. So why don't we just move along to, you've heard a little bit about the why, talked a little bit about the what, and then just very quickly on the how. Again, we don't have a lot of time for this, but just to say that there are lots of ways to measure. There's lots of frameworks, tools, ratings, sets of indicators. You can also use case studies. There are more technical approaches like impact evaluation or valuation monetization. Just to say that if you go at these questions in the right order, start with your why, figure out the what, grapple with some of the questions around direct versus indirect impact, it's much easier to then understand how you should measure. And so, yeah, that would be, I think, my advice on the kind of flow. We have a question on what's a good place to start around learning around impact measurement from home, and what are some resources that we'd recommend. One place I'd encourage you is we have a set of webinars that we run annually through our programs. And I think maybe when we share the follow-up information from this, we can send you a link to that. If you go to the Site Business School YouTube channel or through our Social Impact Program YouTube channel, we have all of these webinars where we get into the details on, for example, some of these measurement approaches. We also talk about some of the questions in terms of how different practitioners are addressing a lot of these questions in practice, how they make choices between these, what is it they should measure, what are the tensions they face in doing measurement within their organizations, and then as they think about how they collect and use data, how to improve on that within their organizations, or really what gets in the way of maybe making the right decisions. So we can share, and maybe Annabelle, you could do this to share in the chat box, or maybe when we follow up with everyone after this and the recording to just give you a bit more information. So I see we've got another comment from Alexander, who says that the CHOP challenge from his organization is to combine what to measure and how to measure, because there are lots of different departments. And so what we're really trying to measure might be diluted, and then how to measure is also a bit of a challenge. So I think that's a really important perspective. And it's not unusual if you're running an organization that has different kinds of stakeholders, different departments, different teams. One way I think is to almost go back to this type of framework and say, if we had to fill each of these boxes, and if we ask different members within our organization teams to actually describe how they fit within each of these boxes, what they want to prove, improve, and learn, how they might fill out their box, what do they think that others within their organization are trying to achieve as a result of doing impact measurement, and then use that to facilitate a series of discussions to identify how to prioritize. That can really go a long way to ensuring that people have a shared understanding of what they're already doing, on what basis they make decisions. It might also improve the transparency of decision making, because often we want to make sure that if we're collecting information, that we're using it and that we understand how decisions are made. And as organizations get complex, it gets much more harder for us to understand, are we just valuing certain kinds of information over others? Do we value numbers over stories? Do we try and value certain kinds of evidence over other kinds of evidence? So often transparency is a really important outcome from being clear on these kinds of discussions. So why don't I just very quickly, seeing that we are now in the last part of our discussion, just give you some things to think about in terms of some broad trends, challenges, and perhaps opportunities. And then we'll take a few more questions before we close it out. So I want to just highlight, again, we do like lots of sessions on these kinds of things and webinars on these, but just very quickly to maybe give you a sense of globally some of the things that we're seeing around opportunities, challenges, and maybe future directions. So one kind of opportunity or interesting trend is that we traditionally have evaluated or assessed programs. And so often we think about them as very straightforward. We provide a training program, people will get more skills, and they will be able to access better jobs. Or we will provide access to improved healthcare intervention. People will then eventually have better access and outcomes, which will lead to better quality of life. The reality is that we know that it's not as simple as the kind of one cause and one effect. There are often many causes that lead to many effects. And so moving from programmatic ideas or interventions to more systems focused that account for complexity is really quite challenging, but is how we are now beginning to think about measurement, so that we have more complex theories of change, We have more complex ways in which we identify the cause and effect relationships. And we have maybe a bit more humility around the things we choose to measure and what our contribution is. So this is, again, a whole set of trends and work that is just beginning to get more sophisticated. Secondly, there are lots of different standards, and I'd also add frameworks and tools. This is just a snapshot from some of the work that us and others are doing around the fields of impact investing and social finance, but there are literally hundreds now of different standards, approaches, and tools and methodologies. And so the trend to having more standards can be helpful because there's pretty much one standard for you if you want to find one, but that's often the wrong question. It's not usually about picking one standard. It's probably trying to identify which set of standards might be able to be applied for your organization, which can sometimes be quite tricky because it feels like it's fragmented, or maybe there are too many choices. The good news, I think, in terms of a trend is that many of these standard setters are beginning to be much more deliberate about how they are interacting and being more interoperable with each other. So I think there's really good signs as we think about forward-looking how standard setters are going to be trying to streamline standard setting rather than just create more and more standards and make it more confusing. A third trend is that we're seeing in the funder landscape in particular, but also in the investor landscape, a lot of experimentation around how you can talk about funding outcomes, not just funding programs or outputs. A lot of innovation around social impact bonds, outcomes financing, and maybe some of this is already being tested in your organizational context or in the areas you work in. So if you work in employment, as an example, but also many other thematic areas, I'd encourage you to just look up social impact bonds, which are trying to provide some ways for public, private, and nonprofit sectors to come around the table to think about these questions around outcomes and financing a bit differently. Lots of opportunities, but also lots of challenges because there's much we don't know yet around what the right frameworks and tools are, but there's also been a lot of learning in the last 5 years. And then finally, but maybe not surprisingly, technology is being deployed across many types of impact measurement settings to be able to collect data more efficiently, but also to be able to analyze and report data in ways that are helping us to make better decisions. So again, some pros and cons. Technology can be used in ways that are really helpful, particularly to reach different people, to have access to more information, to interpret that information. But often there are also challenges around privacy, around how we think about using a lot of different data points to infer a judgment, and also just to be clear around the limitations of technology, all of which maybe are familiar to many of you. Some of the big challenges, again, very quickly, this question of how we balance numbers when we think about measurement, as well as narratives. Often the stories are really what get us emotionally connected to the questions and issues that we work on, but also impact measurement tends to rely quite heavily on numbers. And so finding the right balance for your organization is really key. Often organizations are collecting more data than they are using, impact data. And so thinking about how that is going to play out in your organization, really looking at each data point that you're collecting and thinking about how it might influence decision-making in your organizations. There's a lot of concern these days around impact washing, kind of similar to greenwashing. So organizations are overclaiming impact or maybe providing you an incomplete picture of the impact that they're creating. And so that is becoming more and more a concern, which is why we're seeing a lot of standards. And then finally, just thinking about how you can close the feedback loop when you are collecting information from your clients or users or stakeholders. So often we think about surveys or interviews to try and understand, are things changing in the lives of people as they go through a program or an investment? How do we communicate that information back to them? How do we give them information to also understand what impact we have described, based on what they said, relative to other customers or users or beneficiaries like them? So closing the feedback loop with your users is really important to ensure that there's the degree of transparency and accountability back to them. And that can be transformative in how your organization works. And very quickly, maybe just to build on some of those themes before we wrap up and see if there's any final questions, I would suggest to you, looking ahead, there's some interesting opportunities and risks. One is that measurement is becoming mainstream. Many of you on your iPhones are tracking your steps or tracking your health information. That can be used in lots of different ways to incentivize positive health behaviors. Interestingly, now we have the ability in clothing supply chains and retail supply chains to go all the way back to the point of origin of where materials are coming from. And we can track the entire manufacturing process in terms of how do raw materials get translated into items of clothing, who makes the clothes, how much do they get paid, what's the environmental footprint. And I think these are really exciting opportunities for mainstreaming some of these concepts around how we value social and environmental factors, because I, for example, would really love to base all of my purchasing decisions on those different factors. And I do, and I'm sure many of you do as well. So the fact that that information is going to be more readily available for us in our mainstream and daily decision-making is going to be, I think, a really good opportunity to shift patterns of consumption and buying and even around measurement more broadly in society. There are lots of questions around how impact does not happen or risks to impact, particularly now with the pandemic, so that we may have intentions around impact, but we also have to have an understanding of what are the risks to impact not occurring in the ways that we had hoped, and to be quite explicit around what we might do if that occurs. And then an emerging kind of question with all of this trend towards doing more measurement, we have to ask, who is actually verifying the data that organizations report on their impact? And so we're just beginning to see lots of questions around auditing and verifying impact data, whether that's being done by mainstream accounting firms, by evaluators, by regulators, by many of you maybe. These are really important questions because you can see how if we have a regime around picking certain kinds of individuals or organizations to audit or verify that don't represent the interests of stakeholders that are actually at the receiving end of that impact, or maybe failing to receive that impact, then we have a bit of a disconnect between what is being audited or verified versus what is the reality. So I'm only posing this to maybe provoke a bit of thinking to say that there are lots of opportunities for when measurement is now influencing all of our lives. COVID has really amplified the potential risks to impact not being generated in the way that we hoped, and we have to try and find ways to account for that and mitigate that. And then increasingly, as we get more sophisticated around measurement, thinking about who is doing the measurement and who is verifying it will become even more important as we think about how we build regulation, capacity, and partnerships to do this really well. And so I'm going to pause here and ask Annabelle to jump in to see if we've got any final questions and then to just wrap us up for the day. I hope that at least some of the frameworks and questions that I've posed have given you a bit of food for thought in terms of the kinds of questions and kind of issues you are grappling with, and certainly happy to direct you to more resources as we get into more detail around these themes through our webinars or through our publications. So Annabelle, maybe I'll ask you to jump in now to pose any final questions and wrap us up.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Karim. So I don't think we have any more questions looking at the both the chats. So just really a final thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your day to attend the webinar. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you have any questions regarding either the impact measurement program, the social finance program, or the fellowship, my email address is up on screen, so please feel free to email me directly. We have recorded to today's webinar, so we will make sure that that is available to send out to you, so you can watch it back at a later date if you think that would be helpful, or indeed to share with any colleagues that you think might be interested as well. Apart from that, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.